And how's that sounding? Hey, so does this microphone work? Good. Thank you for your patience. Now 7:45 and we're done. Oh no, 7:06. Why do we do it this way? Because we can. Next week, Wednesday night lab will go. Merry Christmas. In 2 weeks, Wednesday night lab will go dark. Happy New Year. In 3 weeks, Janine Lark from Horticulture will be here. She'll be talking about genetic diversity matters. A field exploration of 695 carrot varieties. You have ever tried to grow carrots from seed? You know how hard it is just to grow one variety, let alone 605. And she's going to give a genetic and genomic analysis of carrots. And then on January 12th, John Berry from Chemistry is going to be here to talk about his work on harnessing energy from ammonia. So thanks for coming tonight. I hope to see you in 3 weeks in the new year. Now, 1, 2, 3. Welcome everybody to Wednesday Night Lab. I'm Tom Zinnan. I work here at the UW-Madison Biotechnology Center. Housework with the Extension Wisconsin H. And on behalf of those folks and our organizers, PB Wisconsin, the Wisconsin Alumni Association, and the UW-Madison Science Alliance, thanks again for coming to Wednesday Night at the Lab. We do this every Wednesday, 50 times a year. Tonight, my pleasure to introduce to you Randy Jackson. He's a professor in the Department of Agronomy, and he also works with the Wisconsin Energy Institute and the Great Lakes Bioenergy Research Center. Randy, I get to ask you the 5 questions you have been prompted so that you can remember. Randy, where were you born?
I was born in Linwood, California.
Where's Linwood?
It's in LA.
Where'd you go to high school?
I went to high school at La Habra High School in Southern California County.
And then where'd you go for undergrad and what did you study?
I went to UC Riverside and studied baseball. But then along the way, they made me declare a major and I declared environmental science.
And then baseball, what did you major in?
Injured elbow.
Left or right?
Left.
You were a pitcher.
I was.
All right.
Yeah.
Keep going. This is great.
Don't get me going on baseball.
Okay. So I'm going to do a balk here. Then where'd you go for your advanced degrees?
I went to Humboldt State University.
North.
Yeah. And I studied natural resource sciences and went to UC Berkeley, where I studied science policy management. With Trina McMahon, who was here last week.
Wow, back to back. That's great. So last week was lakes, this week was land, UC Berkeley. And then when did you come to UW-Madison?
Same year as Trina, 2003.
Good things come in pairs.
And I was part of a agroecology cluster hire with my mates Claudio Berton from the Department of Entomology and Mike Bell from CNE Soch.
Well, I'm delighted to have you here tonight. Having grown up in northern Illinois, where there's a lot of prairies, hardly any more. And the whole idea of grassland, you're going to talk with us about tonight about Grassland 2.0, restoring prairie and people to agriculture. Would you please join welcoming Randy Jackson back to Wednesday Night at the Lab.
Thanks so much, Tom. It's really a pleasure to be back to Wednesday Night at the Lab and to have a chance to talk to you about this Grassland 2.0 project that I and other folks have been working on now for a couple of years, although really we've been working on it for many, many years. I mentioned that I came here in 2003. My mates in agroecology, Clark Breton and Mike Bell, and really one way or the other, we've been working on and towards Grassland 2.0 project for all these years. This is the latest manifestation. It's a project that's different for us in that it's explicitly about making change. It's explicitly about asking the question, how do we transform our land use and our agriculture in this world, specifically in the upper Midwest, and specifically in the livestock realm. And that's different in that it's not just to trivialize it, but it's not generating and producing knowledge that accumulates for the best society. We've been doing that for a long time, and it's been fun, productive, But Claudio and I in particular were sitting around having a cappuccino one day, and we were thinking, all these publications and not much is changing. What are we going to do about it? And so this Grassland 2.0 project is sort of the manifestation of that. It's a disruptive topic, and a lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight is intentionally meant to be disruptive. I want to make it clear that I'm not blaming anybody for the problems that we have. There's plenty of blame to go around. I'm not pointing a finger at anybody in particular. We have a system broken. We collectively need to fix it. And when I point out and drag and drone on about particular problems, and sometimes my kids say that it's the Bernie Sanders part of my talk where I really rattle off about all problems. I do want to offer solutions, and that's a big part of what Grassland 2.0 is all about. So I really think of the talk tonight in 3 parts. There's some talk about the past, and the reason for that is primarily to give us a sense that land use and agriculture are malleable, they're dynamic and change. I think too often there's this notion that they are the way they are, they're not change, how can we change them? Frankly, this emerged last week when I was watching Trina's presentation. I hung on the last minute of the Q&A, and there's a chat from someone. I don't know who it was. I'm not going to name them. They don't know who it was. Trina had just gotten done talking to us about the blue-green algae in the lakes and cyanobacteria and the problems of the lakes. And of course, rightly picked to land use as a big driver of it, not the main driver of it. And one of the comments was, I'm not going to quote, I'll paraphrase, the lakes are best for decades. We should give up studying and just try and do something about it. Something like that. And I remember thinking, I got to get online, get on here and make a comment. It was too late. Tom cut it off. So we decided to come here and talk about it on stage. And so really Grassland 2.0 is trying to address that question. Like, what are we going to do about it? We've got to do something about it. I want to talk about the present as much as the past. And a lot of the present is intentionally dire. But I want to offer solutions that are at hand. People are implementing solutions now, just not enough. And so we need to turn them. Part of that message is I want to take a little bit of exception with who set up a minute ago and posted it as advertisement for the day. The prairies are gone, that they're not with us anymore. The prairies are still there. The prairies have gone below ground. The prairies have always been below ground. That's where most of the prairie is. And so while we don't see a lot of manifestation of the prairie above ground these days, it's still there. And we plow it, and we grow in it, and build on it, but it's still there. And we need to take care of it, whether it's showing itself. And then finally, I want to talk about the future and just that, we, as a society, we people choose what agriculture and land use look like, and we shape it, our policies and our markets. We've chosen the current system, and we can choose a different system. It's not just this is the way it is. It doesn't have to be this way. So let me move on from that and just about that. We have lots of partners in crime on this project. It's based at UW-Madison, but we have great collaborators at the University of Minnesota, and then the Crooklyn Institute, and Michael Fields and Grassworks, and I'm not going to do all of them. You see them up on the screen. The Savannah Institute, the Picture Project. The organizations that have been doing Grassland 2.0 for a long time, and we're just the latest sort of packaging of it, if you will. Okay. My friend and colleague who passed away about 7 years ago now, Josh Posner, an agronomist in the Department of Agronomy here at W-Madison, always told Greg, his student, every good talk starts with glaciers receded. And that's what I'm going to start with today. When glaciers receded 12,000 years ago, at least they started to recede in this part of the world 12,000 years ago. It wasn't until about 3,000 or 4,000 years ago that what colonized the land that they seeded from was prairie and savanna, prairie and oak savanna. And this is a map showing the tall prairie of the upper Midwest. The ecotone is the oak savanna and the grassland. You can see it cutting through the south part of the state. If we look at where the prairie and savanna were in southwest or in southern Wisconsin in particular, you can see on the left the distribution of the savanna, and on the right the distribution of the prairie. So the savanna really is prairie with trees on it, and so we have a lot of the original grassland, the Grassland 1.0 out on the landscape. And of course, that prairie and savanna complex was significantly managed. It was managed by people for those 3,000 or 4,000 years that it existed after the glacier that receded. It was managed fire. People burned to round up game, push game, elk, bison, etc. To do their hunting easier. They burned to renew and reinvigorate the vegetation to try to track game and bring it in. So they were wholly managed agricultural systems, you might say. How are we doing there, Papa? You want me to pause or keep rolling? Keep going? Okay. So they were highly managed systems. And of course, the folks that managed them were pushed off the land eventually. At least pushed off of the land they were managing, that they were used to on. And so here's a map from Cathcote's dissertation work at St. Cloud State. And it's just one example of folks being pushed off of the land. And this is an example where they were pushed west and pushed into the Blue Earth Reservation. And one of the key elements of her thesis was to talk about the fact that this was organized and systematic, the pushing of the people off the land. It was incidental and just sort of something that was happening, let's push people off the land. It was systematic and organized. The same sorts of things happened to African Americans who were trying to out an existence in what was called the Northwest Territory. Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, and Wisconsin indicated there. There were a lot of black settlements back in the day. By back in the day, I mean the early to mid 1800s. But similar to the indigenous folks, those people were systematically pushed off the land in an organized and coordinated way. And part of why I'm bringing this up is that I want to just acknowledge that this happened, that we have benefited from it, most of us here today, and that this pushing people off the land thing continues today. We're pushing other people off the land today, and it's been sort of history, and we have to acknowledge it and learn it. That's the main reasons, and that I wanted to wrap up, other than to also put up the wonderful book this map was taken up, which is The Bone and Sinew of the Land, that talk about African American settlers trying to eke out an existence on the land in the face of this enormous pressure to push them away. And of course, once they were pushed away, or as they were pushed away, let's say, the type of farming that took hold by large European farmers of German and Norwegian, Swiss, and all things descent, was wheat farming in the part of the world in Wisconsin. And it was a type of wheat farm that frankly was extractive. They tore up the prairie, which I know it's hard to see on the grainy photo there. They tore up the prairie with these massive teams of horses or oxen that pulled these plows, these moldboard plows that ripped through the prairie sod, turned it upside down. And they talk about how as they dragged it through the sod, it sounded like a fusillade of armament going off, cannons popping, shots being fired, and massive roots, and the fibrous roots below ground were broken up. It was a mine of the energy that the prairie had built below the ground for 3,000 or 4,000 years. Not only was it mining, it was a release of it to the atmosphere that we'll talk more about here in a minute. Now, that went on for a little while, maybe 10, 15, 20 years, until the repeated farming of wheat and the repeated disturbance of the soil and beating up of the soil with a plow created a environment for pest pressure. And the chinch bugs That's the thing you hear so often. We've got to feed the world. How are we going to feed 10, 11 billion people by the year 2050? And so when we look at corn use in the United States, where we have 300 million acres of you can see where 27% of that corn goes. It goes into our gas tanks. We make ethanol with it. Now let me just say that you can find 1,000 studies showing that corn-based ethanol is a net energy gain and 1,000 showing that it's a net energy loss, but it is a net energy push because you can find 1,000 either way. As my colleague Jason Hill at the University of Minnesota has said to me, it's really like figuring out how to turn natural gas and petroleum into petroleum that we can put into our gas tank as ethanol. Because there's so much energy that goes into converting the corn grain into ethanol. That's basically a push. So we're just taking that fossil fuel and redirecting it to our gas tanks eventually. Are we good here? I'm getting a lot of echo. Yeah. Should I stop or keep going?
Keep going.
Keep going? Okay. So that's where, a quarter more of our corn grain goes. About 40% of it, 39% of it goes to feed livestock in confinement. Okay, whether that's beef, dairy, swine, poultry, or other. It feeds animals that are confined into small spaces, and it's immensely productive. Keep going. It's immensely productive, but with all kinds of attendant environmental problems. Nutrients leak out of the feedlots, let alone the corn system where the feed is grown. Animal health, welfare, and well-being issues abound. Interestingly, about 16% of the corn goes to export. Now you might think this is the feed the world part, but here's data that show where that exported corn is going: Japan, China, Korea, Mexico, etc. It's being sold to countries who use it to feed to their livestock. It's not going to feed people who are in dire need of calories. It's being used to feed affluent countries like ours. And then there's 9% of it that goes to food and industrial uses, which is to say high fructose corn syrup for Coca-Cola and Pepsi and other highly processed foods. And then interestingly, from the Feed the World perspective, 9% of it is residual, which I still haven't quite figured out what that means. It piles up in barges, it piles up on the shores of the Mississippi River, and I think is eventually discarded. So I just want us to have clear eyes when we talk about why do we grow all this corn and what is it for, and why do we mine the soils that the way we do. Let's also have clear eyes about who's benefiting from this. These are data I downloaded from USDA Economic Research Service, the ERS. And it's over a 23-year period, and it's the net profitability of corn over that 23-year period. And you don't have to squint at it very hard or very long to see that corn is not profitable for farmers most years. In fact, in the northern crescent, which is where we are, this blue region up here, this is the blue line here, there were 4 or 5 years out of the last 23 years that corn was profitable. Without any government payments, without any insurance. Okay, so this is just grow the corn and sell it on the market. The government makes up the difference in bad years. They de-risk it. We incentivize it. We choose what the landscape should look like, or we choose what the landscape looks like with our policies. We have to overcome this. We just simply have to. I spent 2 years asking people on the Grassland 2.0 project, how do we change the system? We've got to stop this subsidy situation. It's killing us. Okay, why do we do it? We've got nitrate contamination in most of our groundwater in Wisconsin. Why do we have nitrate contamination in most of our groundwater? A lot of manure, to be sure. from cows that are in confined animal feeding operations. But the cows aren't just producing that manure, and I really dislike that term of manure production. They're recycling back the nutrients that they've taken from feed that we fed them. And we're spreading those nutrients on fields that are basically sieves. That's what cornfields are. About 20 to 30% of the nitrogen that we apply to a cornfield goes through the sieve, gets below the rooting zone, and gets into drinking water. It's just as simple as that. There's data after data after data set showing this. 20 to 30% of the nitrogen that's applied to a cornfield ends up in the water, the groundwater. Another 10 or 15% of it goes off as nitrous oxide gas, which is a greenhouse gas. So maybe 50, I don't know if I'm doing my math right here, but let's say 50% of the nitrogen that we add ends up in our environment, not being used for plant growth. And yet all of our management of nutrients is based on the plant growth angle, that the plants need it. We have to change our nutrient management to focus on keeping it out of the environment rather than focusing on what the plants need. So that's nitrogen. Of course, then we also apply that manure in times when the crops aren't growing. We apply it on frozen ground, even though that's not supposed to happen. And we get massive runoff events. And with that, those runoff events, we lose soil sediment and we lose phosphorus. And we lose a lot of phosphorus. The phosphorus finds its way into our surface waters, lakes and streams, and drives the algal blooms that Trina talked to us about last week. It's devastating. Estimates are 60 to 70% of the phosphorus that goes into the Yahara chain of lakes is coming from agriculture. I'm not pointing at anybody, it's not their fault. It's not the farmer's fault. They're responding to a system that's been set up, and they're responding to the system the way that it's incentivizing them to. We've got to change the system. Okay. I think Trina showed a bunch of these pictures last week, so I'm not going to belabor them, but it does particularly irk me that I can't swim in Lake Wingra, that I can't swim out here off the docks at Lake Mendota. And again, like I said, with the profitability of corn, why? Why are we doing this? Since I've been here in 2003, since I got here in 2003, the state has lost 500 dairy farms a year. 2 a day, more than 2 a day. Here's just an example from Rock and Walworth counties where back in 1975, there were over 500 or 600 farms, and now there's 50 or 60 remaining. But milk production has gone up. The number of cows has stayed the same. Our dairy science department is fantastic. They do an amazing job of genetic improvement and management improvement. They're improving the efficiency of the animals, but it's devastating to our communities. And so we're ending up with more and more farms that look like the one on the right here. Industrial. Again, I can't say this enough. I'm not pointing a finger at the CAFO farmer. The CAFO farmer is doing what they have to do to stay in business. I've talked to many of them. If I don't grow, if I don't get bigger, I'm out. It's a treadmill of production that I can't get off. The system is set up for it. And it's devastating to our communities. There's hollowed out communities, empty businesses, schools are unfunded, tax base is withering away. Okay, so these are tumultuous times, to say the least. We've got systemic inequality. I'm not an expert in that, but I thought it was important that we bring it up here and talk about it. Soil, atmosphere, and water degradation. I haven't even gotten to the biodiversity plummeting part, and that might be the scariest part of the story. Since 1970, we estimate we've lost 3 billion birds in North America, largely because of the way we do agriculture. Pollinators are crashing. There's now 266 herbicide-resistant plants that can't be controlled. The herbicides are no longer effective. And there aren't any new herbicides coming online. And here at the bottom, I've listed climate change, which by all accounts tops everybody's list as the most existential, the biggest existential threat that we have. It exacerbates all these other three: social injustice, environmental injustice. Okay, I'm transitioning away from the Bernie Sanders part. Sorry, Bernie. What would sustainable ag look like? It would be profitable. It would stimulate vital, thriving rural communities. It would produce high quality products that would support extant and emerging markets. It would hold on to soils and nutrients. It would build soil rather than wear it away, which would help draw down carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It would support and enhance biodiversity. And it would connect people back to the food, back to the land in ways that they're disconnected now. When we restore grasslands to our agricultural systems, we're healing the planet, we're healing ourselves, we're healing the land, we're healing ourselves. Remember the identity that Leopold left us with. Well-managed grazing of perennial grasslands helps the land heal. That's the Grassland 2.0 part. We've got to restore the functionality of the original prairie to our agriculture. And it's going to mean that it's a little bit less productive. It's just a corollary of it. Because the reason that it helps the land heal is that it gives back to the land as much as we take, if it's well managed. We can have grasslands that are poorly managed and take more than we give back. They have the same problems that annual grain crops have. Well-managed grazing helps the land heal. We must restore the functionality of the prairie to our agriculture. It doesn't mean returning everything to native prairie. I would love that. I know there are folks here in the audience that would love that. It means grassland in all its forms. So when I say restore ecosystem function, I'm talking about its ability to hold on to carbon and nutrients and biodiversity. Josh Posner, who I led off the talk talking about, started this project in 1989 called WIXT, the Wisconsin Integrated Cropping Systems Trial. This is a student, Greg, who works with me still. Greg did his PhD work looking at the difference in soil organic carbon from 1989 to 2009, a 20-year period at WIXT. And what he compared were continuous corn and soybeans in rotation with minimum tillage, so reduced tillage, organic corn, soybeans with a wheat cover crop, conventional corn and alfalfa rotations, like so much of Wisconsin has, an organic corn with oat cover crop alfalfa rotation, and cool season grassland pasture that's grazed by livestock. You don't have to stare at this very long to see that over that 20-year period, all of the systems lost carbon. They all lost soil carbon, except for the pasture, which didn't gain or lose. It held on to what it had. Now, interestingly, and I could give a whole talk about this and have, the pasture gained carbon. It was significantly greater, positive here, in the surface 30 centimeters. But from 30 to 90 centimeters down to the glacial till, it lost carbon. And so one of the things that we're studying now is what's happening down there. Is it because we don't have prairie grasses that put roots really deep? Are there other grasses and plants that can put roots really deep? And will that help us build carbon down there? Excitingly, we have a grad student, Claire Dietz, who's working on the 30-year story here. So stay tuned. Part of restoring ecosystem function is holding on to nutrients. Tracy Campbell's a grad student who is working with Chris Kucharik, who's the chair of the Department of Agronomy. And she just published her master's work where she used an agroecosystem model to predict phosphorus loading into the lakes around Lake Mendota, Lake Monona, et cetera, in the Ohio River watershed. And the takeaway message from her modeling work was that in order for us to meet EPA mandated total maximum daily load goals for phosphorus reduction, I know it's a mouthful, that we could do it by 2070 if we reduce the number of animal units in the watershed by half and put 50% of the ag land in perennial grass. And importantly, that's an and. This is really one of the things that is the impetus for the Grassland 2.0 project. We're talking about inverting the landscape from one that's annual grasslands, annual corn, annual soybeans, to one that's in perennial grass. My colleague Claudio, who I've mentioned several times here, has been working on this model that he calls Smartscape. And Smartscape is a modeling tool that allows us to run scenarios. What would the landscape look like in different ways? So here, the scenario that's been selected is just in the Yahara watershed. Show us all the corn and soybeans from a particular year. I think it was 2014 or 2015. Doesn't change that much from year to year. It looks like most of the land, of course, there's a lot of urban agriculture urban land that's not in agriculture. But you can see here that it's about 1.9 million acres of land, or about 31% of the total area. And that's contributing phosphorus to the lakes of about 1.3 million pounds a year. The cool thing about this tool that he has is that you can run these scenarios where you ask, what happens if I convert part of that land or all of that land? And so what we did here was we asked, what if we took all the corn and soybeans that are 500 feet from a stream and put them into perennial grass? And that turns out to be about 20% of all the corn and beans. Within 500 feet of a stream. This is a screenshot from Google Maps, showing corn and bean farming going right up to the straightened streams. This is the problem. This is where most of the phosphorus comes in to the waterways. And that's what we did here. We transformed all the corn and beans to perennial grass where the corn and beans were within 500 feet of the stream. That turns out to have been about 19% of all the corn and bean land. But the P loading, the phosphorus loading, went down dramatically by 67%. There are solutions. A 500-foot buffer strip is a lot. I get it. I get it that a farmer's listening to this going, that's not a solution. It's not in the current calculus, but we've got to change the calculus so that the farmer can see that a 500-foot buffer strip or bigger is part of the solution. How do we do that? How do we incentivize that? And so this is just to play out that story that when we ran the model for 1,000-foot buffer strips, we could reduce phosphorus loading by 90%. So we've got to convert a big part of our land from annuals to perennials to restore the structure of the ecosystem, which is related to its function. Okay, here's a table of data that we've been working on in Grassland 2.0 that just compares 3 different scenarios. Corn and soybeans tilled with no cover crops, corn and soybeans not tilled with cover crops, and pasture and managed grazing. And I'm not going to walk through all these numbers, but the point is we get massive gains by transforming it to pasture. And I mentioned there's going to be lower yields, whether it's milk or meat. There are going to be lower yields. But yields don't have to equal profit. And in fact, as Jean-Paul Chavaz showed about over a decade ago, looking at our WICS data, whether it was with government payments and organic premiums or with none, the rotational grazing system, which is the far right-hand bars here in both cases, provided the highest net profitability. The highest net profitability compared to corn and soybeans, no-till, organic corn, etc. Likewise, Tom Kriegel, who's an economist with the Center for Dairy Profitability, collected actual real farm data over 15 years comparing grazing and confinement operations. He downloaded all of this data from databases that farmers actually put their cost their production into and their income statements, et cetera. And the takeaway message was that the grazing operations, on average, were almost twice as profitable as confinement operations. Confinement operations where the cows are kept in confined barns year round. The cost of production were so much lower in the grazing situation. The profitability was almost twice as high. And this is just sort of more of that depiction, but in the beef sector. So in the beef sector, profitability can be much higher than cash grain farming for corn and beans. Now, in any particular year, like this year, corn prices might go up to $7 a bushel. Cash grain's probably going to win. But if you look at it over a 15 to 20 year period of time, the grazing situation is always going to be more profitable. So Grassland 2.0 is agriculture that's part of the solution. I think he's trying to get your attention back there. Tom, are you trying to get Max? No? Yeah. Sorry, he was waving and pointing at me. We okay? Yes. Okay. So agriculture can be part of the solution. And one of the things that we're excited about in Grassland 2.0 is that farmers like Craig Van Duvel here on the right, he's a CAFO operator at about 100, has about 125 milking cows. Adam Abel, who's pictured on the left here, is an NRCS consultant, helping him transition to grazing. And I went out and met with Craig and Adam, and they showed us this situation. And it is amazing how excited Craig Van Duvel is about farming. And he was ready to get out. He was ready to call it a day. He had inherited the farm from his parents, was on the treadmill of production, didn't see any opportunity to keep going in the dairy business until Adam introduced him to grazing. And now he is so bullish on grazing. He's like the biggest acolyte and advocate for grazing that you could ever imagine. Likewise, young people are super excited about grazing. I get students in my agroecology and grassland ecology class every year who are so thrilled that agriculture can be part of the solution. They want to be part of it. It's infectious. They want to know how to do more of it. This is Megan Paris here on the left, daughter of Bert Paris, who's an organic grass-based farmer down in Belleville, Wisconsin. And she is coming back to the farm after left the farm to get away from it as a teenager. She wanted out. She got a job. I think she came to UW-Madison, got a degree, got a job in the insurance industry. Bert transitioned to grazing, and now she's so thrilled she wants to come back and take over the farm, raise her family there. We've got to take care of the land. We've got to take care of ourselves. So let me just wrap up with a quick romp through what it is we're trying to do at Grassland 2.0. We've got a system on the right here that is a depiction of Grassland 2.0. Healthy ecosystems, healthy communities, healthy people, all being sort of managed collaboratively with folks. But we here out on the left, we have our current system, which is indicated by a sort of system of gears that are locked in. You know, I started the talk by saying we got to be able to think bigger than the current system. We're sort of locked in by these ideas of productivism, that we have to produce more, that we have to grow. Our institution, the one we're in now, is part of the problem. The power structure is part of the problem. We could talk a lot more about this, but we're sort of locked into it. And how do we crack this lock? What we're trying to do in Grassland 2.0 is come at it from two directions, from a top direction and a bottom direction. And I'll just say that the top direction is part of what I'm doing tonight, trying to tell stories and raise awareness about what's possible. The second item here is trying to describe what healthy ecosystems look like, whether it's healthy soils or clean water or biodiversity. This might be that thing that Claudio and I have always been doing, which is trying to produce information about and knowledge about what it looks like. We've got folks that are focused on what an equitable and just transition would look like. And then we've got folks thinking about markets and policies. All of this, we hope, is enough to raise awareness to the point where consumers, where the general public demands change, and that demand is big enough and strong enough to overcome the resistance that is inevitable, the resistance that is here and will continue to be here. And then we have, from the bottom up, what we call learning hubs. And learning hubs are place-based conversations. So we work with folks in a particular place, and here I've indicated where the 5 learning hubs where we're working now are. There are 3 in Wisconsin, 1 in Minnesota, and 1 in Illinois. And in these learning hubs, we're engaged in conversations about what's possible. Again, bigger than the current sort of calculus. Let's think big. What do you want for your grandchildren out of agriculture? How can we get there? And so what those conversations are meant to do is develop what we call agroecological transformation plans. And those plans are meant to be sort of blueprints to make the change happen. Okay, so let me just wrap up by saying we have to restore the function of prairie to our agriculture, and we have to restore prairie to the land. And we have to be creative and inventive and get outside of our heads about what's possible and think about what's really possible in the long term. So thank you. Appreciate it. Happy to entertain any questions.
Questions?
Yes.
You have talked extensively about prairie and dairy and grain farming. I know Iowa is also a hog farming state. Lots of parts of the country are intensive chicken farming.
Yeah.
How does this apply in those agricultural endeavors?
Great question. And a lot of what we're working on, we think applies nicely in that you can raise hogs and you can raise chickens and turkeys and rabbits and whatever else you might want to eat. You can raise them on pasture. Now, they don't always eat just the pasture. They might eat the insects that are in the pasture. You might have to supplement them, etc. But there are ways to do it. And I would say that we're trying to stay focused on the upper Midwestern dominant agriculture. I should say the Wisconsin dominant agriculture. But in as much as one of our learning hubs is in Illinois, when we go down there, a big part of that conversation might be about hogs. Although down there, what's more likely is that there aren't any livestock. They've all been gotten rid of, and it's all just cash grain. And so the conversation there is likely to be, so how do we get grassland going without a lot of livestock around to take advantage of it?
Any question?
Yeah, if we're talking about blaming somebody, shouldn't a good deal of the blame go to Mr. John Deere and the plow that he invented in Illinois in 1837?
Well, I wouldn't blame John Deere. He, again, like farmers, was responding to a system. It was responding to demand. I would blame folks that have doubled down on policies and maintained policies that encourage John Deere to keep making more and more and bigger implements to help us extract from the land. But no, I wouldn't blame John Deere specifically.
Thanks for that talk. Really interesting, really important stuff. My question may be totally simplistic, but kind of bugged me for a while in terms of thinking about soil carbon and introducing pasture for cattle on the landscape from a mass balance perspective. If the amount of carbon that can make it into the soil is capped by photosynthetic activity of the plants that are growing pasture, how does just introducing an herbivore that's eating that grass and excreting it, how does that mechanistically build carbon?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the first part of the answer is just introducing cows doesn't guarantee that carbon's going to accumulate. You know, like I said earlier, the cows are managed poorly and they remove all that photosynthetic material that accumulates, then the system's not going to accumulate carbon. The big point about managed grazing that I didn't make tonight is that if it's done right, it stimulates productivity. It stimulates NPP. It stimulates root growth. And so you're actually building the carbon uptake. And ultimately, that's better off for the chance that the ecosystem might accumulate carbon.
So reallocating kind of some more below ground.
Reallocating and stimulating more. So if you just take a grassland that's undisturbed, and we know this from burning prairies, if you just don't disturb it, that dead biomass piles up, and it starts to suppress subsequent growth just because it's piled up on the surface. The grassland needs some disturbance to stimulate NPP productivity of the grasses. The graziers do the same thing. They come in and get rid of the dead vegetation and stimulate new, highly productive growth. So that if you look at that grassland ungrazed, it would be less productive than when it's grazed well. But grazing it well is, like I say, not a trivial thing, and there's lots of excellent research out there talking about what it means to graze it well.
I sort of talked and following up the Wisconsin Energy Talk a couple weeks ago. I wonder, Bill Tracy's research is Greek to me, but I wonder if we can talk about what his contribution to soil Grassland 2.0 is for nitrogen fixation plants. What Bill Tracy's doing for it. Can you repeat that question?
So the question was, what is Bill Tracy's contribution to Grassland 2.0? Bill is a corn breeder, a sweet corn breeder in the Department of Agronomy, and isn't technically part of the Grassland 2.0 project, although I know he's quite sympathetic and a good supporter of it. So I'm not sure if you're thinking about Jean-Michel Amné, who's doing work with corn, looking at nitrogen fixation in these native land races from Mexico. Maybe that's Bill too.
Well, I guess what is that those departments doing off the age their constituents
got it.
to come along with your way of thinking?
Got it. Thank you. So, like I say, Bill is a sweet corn breeder, and sweet corn is a corn that we actually consume. And so, more power to Bill, getting better and improved varieties of sweet corn and understanding the genetics behind it. We have to have gardens. We have to produce vegetables, and sweet corn would be one of those. Likewise, we have to produce some grain. There's always going to be a need for it. It just shouldn't be the dominant wall-to-wall thing that we grow across the landscape, in my view. So, beyond that, what could other folks in the agronomy department be doing? One of the things we are doing is thinking broader about landscapes and how different types of cropping systems fit into a more coherent and integrated landscape. So if you're going to have corn, if you're going to have beans, if you're going to have wheat, whatever you're going to have, how do you configure the landscape so that it's benign with respect to nutrient contribution to the water, to the atmosphere? There are ways to do that and solutions to do that, and these modeling tools that I described are a big part of that.
Other question?
Yeah, go ahead.
When the land was managed by fire,
I wasn't here for it, but
and neither was I.
I was, it was smoky.
Tom grew up in Illinois.
When the land was managed by fire in this area, there was obviously some net carbon loss or some carbon loss, whether it was net or not, to the atmosphere.
Yep.
How does using grazing animals as essentially a management replacement for fire is what I'm kind of seeing here, affect that? And how does their hoof activity on the soil, breaking the surface of the soil up, help or hinder the management of soil carbon?
That's a good question. I spent a whole semester in grassland ecology trying to tease that apart, but so let me take a crack at it here. So even the original prairies for those 3,000 or 4,000 years, there were many years when they did not accumulate carbon. You know, they accumulated carbon over the long sweep of time. And there might have been drought periods when they were a net carbon source to the atmosphere. Likewise, our grasslands, you know, we've gone out and done the measurements, and there are some years that a well-managed perennial grassland is a carbon source, and some years it's a sink. And this is part of the problem. I know you didn't ask this, but this is part of the problem with the idea of carbon markets. Are we going to talk about measuring carbon year in, year out? And some years you gain and some you lose, and it's no fault of your own, the climate's changing, et cetera. So that's another conversation. And I'm not really talking about grazing as a replacement for burning. There are a lot of people interested in combining them because they don't do exactly the same thing. One's much more uniform, the burning. One's much more heterogeneous. But a lot of good grazing management, when I talk about well-managed grazing, is trying to eliminate the heterogeneity, the variation that grazing can impart by packing the animals into small spaces for short periods of time so they do a uniform graze and then you move to the next. And so now you've got a nice uniform system. That creates a negative feedback to weed pressure because you've got a nice uniform stand of highly productive plants. So I don't know if I've answered your question exactly. In both cases, whether it's burning or grazing or both, if we stimulate net primary productivity, which is plant growth, we have a chance of building carbon.
Yeah, one topic which is important to many farmers that you didn't discuss would be the question of trees and wood products as a cash crop. And also, isn't there some significant advantages for the soil to leave some portion of the land in woods? Thanks.
Yeah, great question. So the Savannah Institute is part of our project, and the Savannah Institute, they're all about agroforestry and silvopasture and understanding how we can manage, again, on the landscape, the woods and the pasture under the woods. There's definitely a carbon benefit to leaving woods where they are. We know less about how grazing in the woods affects carbon. We know that it can really have negative effects on erosion, and so we have to be very careful grazing on slopes. There's a lot to learn. There's a lot of science to be done there. But there are folks who are focused on it and very interested in that. One of the most interesting studies that's come out lately was by Suzanne Wiesner, who's now at the Biological Systems Engineering. She was working with folks at the Dairy Forage Research Center. And they use eddy covariance towers to understand the carbon balance system. And what they learned is that while the agricultural system can be a net source to the atmosphere of carbon, if you take into account the off-crop habitat that includes the woods, the wetlands, grasslands that you might have, et cetera, if you integrate over that whole land unit, that's a property boundary, a farm unit, that's a net sink. Okay, and so that has some important implications for how we do carbon accounting if we're going to have carbon markets too. Is it just for what you do on the ag land, or is it for your whole farm? In which case you might have some incentive for Tom in Illinois who has taken out all of the hedgerows and all the fence rows and all the off-crop habitat. He doesn't have any anymore. You know, is he going to get rewarded for putting it back, et cetera, et cetera? So good question.
Thank you very much. Thanks for your patience.
Thank you for having me.
Technical issues tonight. Appreciate it. We'll see you in 3 weeks.
We're going back.
Merry holiday, Merry Christmas, Happy breakfast, and Happy New Year. Okay. Then, were you able to turn the recording on? Library, Lion Beard Night, like to join?